My name is Natalie Whitmore. I'm 26 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family has treated me like I never quite graduated from childhood. Not because I'm irresponsible or reckless, but because somewhere along the way, they decided I would always be the extra one, the youngest daughter, the afterthought, the one who should feel grateful just to be included. I live alone in a small but comfortable apartment I pay for myself. I have a stable job, no debt, and a routine I built carefully over the years. I cook my own meals, pay my bills on time, and keep my life quiet and steady. None of that has ever mattered to them. In my family's unspoken hierarchy, I'm still the kid no matter how far I've come. My older brother, Evan Whitmore, is 4 years older than me, and growing up, we were never close. Evan fit perfectly into the version of success our parents admired. He was confident, competitive, polished. His achievements were celebrated like family victories. First car, first promotion, first serious relationship. Each one announced, admired, and remembered. When Evan succeeded, it proved they'd raised him right. When I succeeded, it was acknowledged briefly, then forgotten. Over time, I told myself I was fine with that. I stopped chasing their approval and built a life that didn't require applause. Or at least that's what I believed. Because every so often, something happens that reminds you old wounds never really disappear. They just wait quietly. The reminder came in the form of a dinner invitation. Evan texted me on a Thursday afternoon. No greeting, no warmth, just a message that read, "Dinner Saturday at Mom and Dad's. Everyone will be there. Bring something if you want." When I asked who everyone meant, he replied, "Me, Claire, Mom, Dad, Uncle Daniel. Just come." Claire was his new girlfriend, the one he'd been parading around like proof he'd leveled up in life. I'd met her once at a rushed brunch months earlier. She was flawless in the way people who work in image management tend to be: perfect posture, perfect smile, and an unsettling ability to make you feel evaluated without ever asking a question. I considered declining, but some stubborn part of me still wanted to believe this might be different, that maybe this time I wouldn't feel like an outsider in my own family. So I said yes. I made a pasta salad that afternoon. Nothing extravagant, but thoughtful. Fresh mozzarella, sun-dried tomatoes, arugula, and a balsamic glaze I'd perfected over time. I even shaved early and wore a button-up, which felt embarrassing to admit, but old habits die hard. A small part of me still wanted to be taken seriously. The moment I walked in, I knew something was off. Evan and Claire were already positioned at the center of the kitchen, like hosts of a lifestyle show, wine glasses in hand. My mother was lighting candles with careful precision, and my father was nowhere to be seen. I set my bowl down on the counter. Claire glanced at it briefly. "Oh, pasta," she said, sliding it aside. "We already planned the menu, but I suppose we'll make room." Her tone was polite but dismissive, like she was tolerating an inconvenience. Evan lifted his glass toward me and smiled. "Glad you could make it, Natalie. Tonight's kind of an adults-only atmosphere." He said it like a joke. My mother laughed softly the way she always did when she wanted to smooth something over without actually addressing it. I looked around, confused. "So where am I sitting?" Claire pointed behind me toward the wall, near the coat rack. There was a narrow metal stool pushed awkwardly beside it. No placemat, no chair. Just a paper plate and a plastic cup like something you'd give a kid who showed up unexpectedly. "We ran out of seats," she said calmly. "And you're the youngest." I waited. For my mother to say something. For my father to appear and object. For anyone to acknowledge how humiliating this was. No one did. They just kept moving, talking, pouring wine, acting like this was normal. So I sat. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't know what else to do in that moment. I balanced my plate on my knees while they clinked glasses and laughed around the table. Conversations flowed over me, around me, as if I wasn't there at all. As I chewed cold pasta on that wobbly stool, something settled heavily in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a lack of awareness. It was deliberate. A message wrapped in politeness and passed off as practicality. And for the first time in a very long time, instead of shrinking, I felt something else begin to rise. Slow, sharp, unavoidable. I wasn't imagining this, and I wasn't going to ignore it anymore. Once I was seated, the evening unfolded as if I had already been written out of it. Evan and Claire moved with practiced ease, introducing courses, refilling glasses, and directing conversation the way hosts do when they want control more than connection. The table filled with the sound of cutlery and polite laughter, while I remained pressed against the wall, balancing my plate on my knees, like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Claire presented the first course with theatrical flair, explaining wine pairings and ingredients, as if she were hosting a private tasting. Evan chimed in, correcting details, adding flourishes. No one looked at me. When plates were passed around, they skipped my corner entirely. I told myself it was an oversight. I told myself not to make it a thing. I had spent years perfecting the art of swallowing small humiliations quietly. By the time the second course arrived, it was impossible to pretend. Evan leaned back in his chair, arm draped casually behind Claire, listening as Uncle Daniel praised the ambiance. My mother nodded along, eyes shining with approval, as if the evening were proof that everything in our family was exactly as it should be. I cleared my throat and asked if I should grab a plate. "Oh, we pre-portioned everything," Claire said without hesitation. "I didn't think you'd want steak anyway. You're more of a pasta person, right?" The smile she gave me was thin and practiced. Uncle Daniel chuckled. "Telling me not to be so sensitive that I had food, didn't I?" Evan smirked into his glass. I felt my face heat, but I kept my voice steady, replying that plastic plates were clearly the height of fine dining. The comment earned a sharp laugh from Evan, the kind meant to put someone back in their place. As the courses continued, the divide grew more obvious. Stories were shared. About trips I hadn't been invited on, investments I hadn't been told about, plans that clearly didn't include me. Claire laughed easily, touching Evan's arm, whispering things that made him grin. My mother watched them the way she used to watch Evan at school assemblies, pride written plainly across her face. Dessert arrived on a tiered platter, elegant and excessive. Claire held it up like a centerpiece, describing where they'd bought it, how exclusive the place was, how imported the ingredients were. Plates were passed around again, stopping just short of me. When I spoke up, pointing out that I hadn't been offered any, the room went quiet for a moment. "I didn't think you'd want dessert," Claire said calmly, as if she were doing me a favor. That was when Evan laughed, suggesting that next time they'd put me at the kids' table with a juice box and crayons. The table erupted. Even my parents laughed. My mother covering her mouth, my father finally emerging from the den with an approving nod, as if this were all harmless fun. Something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt final. I excused myself and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my cheeks as I stood on the porch, hands shoved deep into my pockets. I stayed there long enough to slow my breathing, long enough to realize that what hurt most wasn't the jokes or the stool. It was the ease with which they all participated. When I went back inside, the conversation had shifted to money, to investments and properties and future plans. Evan spoke confidently. Claire filling in details, my parents listening like devoted students. I asked a simple question about what Claire actually did for a living, about her previous ventures. The room stiffened. Evan jumped in to defend her. Claire's smile tightening as she dismissed my curiosity as interrogation. My father tried awkwardly to redirect, mentioning that I was good with numbers, that I worked in logistics. For a split second, I thought he might be standing up for me. Claire laughed instead, dismissing the idea that my experience could be useful to someone like her. No one contradicted her. That was the moment I understood my place in that room with absolute clarity. I nodded, said nothing more, and let the calm settle over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. I returned to my stool and sat quietly as the evening wound down, listening as if from a distance. Whatever they thought of me, whatever role they'd assigned me, I knew one thing for certain. I was finished trying to earn a seat at a table that had never been meant for me. I stayed quiet for the rest of the evening, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already said everything that mattered. Evan and Claire didn't notice the shift in me, or if they did, they didn't care. They were too busy enjoying the version of the night that revolved around them. The laughter continued, the wine flowed freely, and the plates were cleared with the smooth efficiency of people who expected nothing to go wrong. That was when I started to notice details I hadn't questioned before. The way the dishes disappeared without anyone moving from their seat. The subtle back and forth through a side door I hadn't paid attention to earlier. The quiet professionalism of people who weren't family at all. It clicked slowly then, all at once. This wasn't just a dressed-up dinner at my parents' house. This was a private dining event. Rented, curated, paid for. The confirmation came when a server approached the table and placed a sleek black folder in front of Evan. I saw the number before anyone else reacted. Nearly $4,000. My mother gasped softly, hand flying to her chest. She said she had no idea it would be so expensive, that she'd assumed this was something small, something casual. Claire waved her off immediately, all confidence and composure. "It's fine," she said. "Evan's got it." Every head turned toward him. For the first time all night, Evan hesitated. His smile flickered just briefly before he pulled out his phone and pretended to scroll. He cleared his throat and said he just needed a moment, that his funds were tied up, that there had been a transfer delay. Claire's posture stiffened. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. Evan laughed, but there was no humor in it now. He said he hadn't realized the total would be that high, that some of his money was temporarily inaccessible. He suggested she spot him just for now. Claire's face drained of color. She admitted she hadn't brought her card that she thought he was paying. My parents exchanged uneasy glances. The server stepped back politely waiting. That was when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I simply leaned against the edge of the table and said calmly that maybe the person who'd planned the evening should handle the bill. Evan shot me a warning look, his voice tight as he told me this wasn't the time. But it was exactly the time. The entire night had been building toward this moment, every insult and exclusion leading here. No one laughed now. The confidence drained from the room, replaced by awkward silence and forced politeness. I didn't stay to watch it unravel. I didn't need to. I picked up my jacket from the coat rack beside that stupid metal stool and walked out without saying goodbye. The cold air outside felt sharp and grounding as I got into my car. I sat there for a few minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired, worn down. But underneath that, there was something else. Resolve. The kind that comes when you finally accept a truth you've been avoiding for years. I drove past my exit and kept going through quiet streets and dim intersections until I pulled into an empty parking lot and shut off the engine. The silence wrapped around me heavy, but honest. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there breathing, understanding that whatever happened next, I was no longer willing to play the role they'd assigned me. That night wasn't just embarrassing, it was clarifying. And once you see the truth clearly, you can't unsee it. The next morning, my phone buzzed before I even finished my coffee. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Evan's name lit up the screen, followed by a message that felt more like a demand than a question. "Are you serious? You embarrassed us last night." There was no concern, no curiosity about how I was feeling, just accusation. I set the phone face down and went to work. The messages didn't stop. Another from Evan, then one from my mother, carefully worded, asking me to call so we could talk this through. Talk this through had always meant smoothing things over, restoring appearances, pretending nothing had happened. When I finally checked the voicemail my mother left, her voice was tight and controlled. She said what I'd done wasn't fair, that Claire was a guest, that we don't humiliate guests. She never asked if I was okay. She never mentioned the stool, the jokes, or the way I'd been treated. I deleted the message and felt something loosen in my chest. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected, but the silence was loud in its own way. Christmas came and went without an invitation. New Year's Eve passed with no call, no text, not even a generic message sent out of obligation. On social media, my family appeared together in carefully staged photos, Evan and Claire dressed perfectly. My parents smiling as if nothing was missing. It was like I'd been edited out of the frame entirely. I spent New Year's Eve alone on my couch, a half-finished beer sweating on the coffee table while fireworks flickered on the television. When midnight hit, I didn't cheer. I just stared out the window at the empty street and let the quiet settle. Loneliness isn't dramatic. It doesn't crash in all at once. It seeps in slowly, filling the space where expectation used to be. After that, I slipped into a low I didn't immediately recognize. Work felt mechanical. Meals became an afterthought. My apartment, once a place I'd been proud of, felt smaller, too quiet. I stopped checking my phone as often because every notification reminded me of who wasn't reaching out. I told myself I was fine, but I was mostly just numb. The shift began somewhere in the middle of that numbness, quietly and without ceremony. One evening, while sorting through paperwork, I came across an old notebook from college. The pages were yellowed corners, bent filled with rough sketches and half-formed ideas. Back then, I'd spent hours scribbling plans for systems and workflows ideas about making things run more smoothly. Logistics had always made sense to me in a way people sometimes didn't. I flipped through those pages, slowly surprised by how familiar it all felt. One idea stood out, something I'd circled more than once, a streamlined logistics platform designed for small local businesses. Nothing flashy, just something functional, adaptable, and honest. I didn't know why I'd abandoned it. Probably because no one had ever taken it seriously, including me. That night, I opened my laptop and started tinkering. At first, it was just a distraction, a way to fill the silence. I built rough outlines, made notes, ran numbers. Then it became something else. Nights turned into weeks. I stopped watching social media. I stopped waiting for messages that weren't coming. I poured my energy into building something that felt solid, something that didn't require anyone else's approval. For the first time in a long while, I felt focused, grounded. I wasn't fixing my family. I wasn't replaying that dinner in my head. I was moving forward quietly, one decision at a time. And without realizing it, I had begun to build a life that didn't leave room for the people who had made me feel small. What started as a way to pass the time slowly became the center of my days. I worked my regular job, came home, ate something quick, and then opened my laptop again. At first, it was spreadsheets and rough diagrams, lists of problems I'd noticed over the years, working in logistics and ideas for how to fix them. I kept everything simple on purpose. No bloated features, no buzzwords, just systems that made sense. I researched quietly, reading about similar platforms, noting where they failed, where they overpromised and underdelivered. Most of them were designed for scale before they were designed for people. That was the gap I focused on. Small businesses didn't need flashy dashboards or complicated analytics. They needed reliability, predictability, something that worked without demanding constant attention. Once I had a rough framework, I started reaching out, carefully. I emailed a few local cafes and bakeries I'd frequented back when I still made time to enjoy small routines. I didn't oversell it. I told them I was building a beta system and offered it for free in exchange for honest feedback. Most didn't respond. A couple declined politely. Then one small cafe on the east side said yes. That yes changed everything. I customized the system for them, mapped their delivery zones, set up scheduling, and stayed up late monitoring how it performed. I checked logs obsessively, fixed bugs, adjusted workflows. Within a few weeks, they told me their delivery times had improved and customer complaints had dropped. They asked if they could recommend me to another shop. I said yes before they finished the sentence. 2 became 5. 5 became a handful more. I wasn't making real money yet, but that wasn't the point. I was building proof. Evidence that this wasn't just an idea scribbled in a notebook, it was real. Around that time, I got a call from Marcus, an old friend from college I hadn't spoken to in years. We'd lost touch the way people do when life pulls them in different directions. He worked in operations for a regional courier company now and had seen a vague post I'd made online about a pilot project. "What you're building," he said, "this actually makes sense. You should pitch it." I laughed it off at first, but he didn't let it go. He invited me to come by his office, promised an introduction to his manager. I almost said no. Old instincts kicked in the voice that said not to overreach, not to embarrass myself. But I went anyway. I printed a short overview. Nothing flashy, just clear explanations and numbers. I walked into that office telling myself I didn't need their approval. I just needed to be honest about what I'd built. The meeting wasn't dramatic. No one stood up and applauded. But they listened. They asked questions. At the end, they offered a paid pilot program. 1 region. 6 weeks. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was validation. Real, tangible validation. I accepted on the spot. The weeks that followed were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. I refined the platform, worked closely with their team, adjusted everything to fit their roots and needs. I barely slept, barely noticed the days passing, but I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. For once, my focus wasn't on what I'd lost. It was on what I was building. Then one night, my phone buzzed. It was Evan. "Can we talk?" No apology, no acknowledgement of the dinner, the silence, or the months that had passed. Just a message that assumed access. I stared at it for a long time before setting my phone face down and returning to my work. A few days later, another message came through, this one more casual, asking if I was working on some app thing and saying that was cool. I didn't respond. Something fundamental had shifted. The more I built, the less I needed explanations or closure. I wasn't trying to prove anything to them anymore. I was proving something to myself. When the pilot program ended successfully and conversations began about expanding it, I didn't celebrate loudly. I didn't post updates or share the news with anyone who hadn't earned a front row seat in my life. I just kept going steady and focused, knowing that for the first time, I had something no one could minimize, mock, or take away from me. And I was only getting started. The invitation came from Marcus near the end of the pilot program. He mentioned it casually, like it wasn't a big deal, which was usually how he delivered information that absolutely was. There was a networking dinner that weekend, he said. Investors Operations leads a few people from tech and logistics. He'd already put my name on the list. I almost declined out of habit. I told him I wasn't great at networking, that I preferred to keep my head down and work. Marcus laughed and said most of the people there felt the same way. They just wore better jackets. Show up, he told me. Be yourself. That's enough. On Saturday night, I stood in front of my mirror, longer than I wanted to admit, adjusting a blazer I rarely wore. I told myself this wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about showing up where I belonged. Still, as I drove into the city, my stomach tightened with a familiar mix of nerves and doubt. The venue was a hotel ballroom downtown, all glass and soft lighting. The kind of place designed to make everyone feel important. I checked in, accepted a drink I didn't touch, and scanned the room, already planning my escape routes. That was when I saw them. Evan stood near the bar, a glass of white wine in his hand, laughing a little too loudly. Claire was beside him, perfectly dressed posture, flawless, her eyes moving constantly as she surveyed the room. She looked exactly the same as she always had, confident and polished, but there was something different too. Tension. A tightness around her smile that hadn't been there before. Evan noticed me first. His laughter faltered mid-sentence, his expression freezing as our eyes met. Claire followed his gaze and stiffened almost imperceptibly. I felt a strange calm settle over me. This time, I wasn't cornered. I wasn't unprepared. I hadn't stumbled into their world by accident. I belonged here as much as anyone else. I poured myself a glass of water and moved toward the edge of the room, letting them decide whether to approach. It didn't take long. Claire came first, her smile snapping into place as she crossed the floor, Evan trailing behind her. "Natalie," she said brightly, as if we'd run into each other at a coffee shop. "I didn't know you'd be here." I nodded. Funny how that works. Her eyes flicked over me, assessing, recalculating. "Are you here with someone?" "I'm on the guest list," I said simply. "I've been consulting with a company here." Evan raised an eyebrow. "Consulting?" "More like a partnership," I replied. "I built something they're testing." There was a pause, brief but telling. Claire recovered first, laughing softly. "Well, that's unexpected. Turns out I do more than bring pasta to family dinners," I said, my tone light but steady. The color rose in her cheeks. Evan cleared his throat and gestured toward the room. He said they'd been talking to people from an investment firm, hinting at opportunities, at big plans. I wished him luck and meant it in the same distant way you wish someone well when their path no longer intersects with yours. Claire suggested we all catch up properly sometime, maybe dinner. I smiled and told her that sounded nice. Then I looked at Evan and added, almost casually, "Just make sure you bring your wallet this time." I didn't wait for their reaction. I walked away, joining Marcus and letting the conversation pull me forward. For the rest of the evening, I spoke with people who listened, who asked thoughtful questions, who remembered my name. I handed out a simple one-page overview of my project, clean and direct. No hype, no promises I couldn't keep. When I left that night, the city air felt lighter. Running into Evan and Claire hadn't rattled me. It had clarified something I'd already begun to understand. I wasn't chasing their recognition anymore. I was building something real, and the gap between us was growing wider by the day. I didn't plan what came next in a single night, and I certainly didn't frame it as revenge. What I did was notice patterns, and once you start noticing them, it's hard to stop. Evan and Claire lived on perception. Their careers, their social circles, even their relationship depended on being seen a certain way. Confidence, success, upward momentum. None of it was loud, but all of it was carefully curated. I already knew how fragile that kind of structure could be. Out of curiosity more than spite, I started looking more closely at Claire's professional footprint. Not digging, not hacking, not doing anything unethical, just reading what was already public. Her LinkedIn profile was immaculate, filled with polished posts about leadership strategy and brand trust. She positioned herself as someone who understood reputation better than anyone else. That made the cracks easier to spot once I slowed down and paid attention. Her posts frequently highlighted Evan's projects, tagging him during client-facing events, praising ventures he was leading or advising. On the surface, it looked supportive. In practice, it blurred professional boundaries in ways her own industry quietly frowned upon. I saved screenshots, not as ammunition, but as documentation. Facts have weight all on their own. At the same time, I took a closer look at Evan's ventures. The confident language he used, the titles he claimed, the way he spoke about capital and growth. Again, nothing secret. Company registries, archived web pages, old pitch decks that hadn't aged well. A pattern emerged quickly. Big promises, shallow foundations, a lot of forward motion without much substance underneath. I organized everything carefully, more out of habit than malice. Timelines, sources, cross-references. When something didn't line up, I noted it and moved on. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't editorialize. I just let the information sit exactly as it was. Then I did something that surprised even me. I built a small, nondescript website. No flashy design, no branding that screamed for attention. It functioned more like a public bulletin than an exposé. I uploaded a brief overview outlining Evan's ventures, their stated goals, and their documented outcomes, all supported by publicly available sources. No accusations, no conclusions, just questions anyone doing due diligence might reasonably ask. I didn't share it right away. I let it exist quietly, indexed and waiting. Meanwhile, I continued focusing on my own work. The pilot program expanded. New conversations opened. I stayed busy, grounded, careful not to let my attention drift too far backward. Still, I couldn't ignore the subtle signs that something had shifted. Evan's online presence grew quieter. His posts became less frequent, less confident. Claire, on the other hand, grew louder, filling the silence with motivational quotes and vague references to resilience and trust. It was only a matter of time. The first ripple reached me through Marcus, who mentioned casually that someone in his network had asked about Evan's background after stumbling across some odd inconsistencies. He didn't know it was connected to me, and I didn't tell him. I just nodded and changed the subject. From there, things moved faster than I expected. A company Evan had been advising quietly removed his profile from their website. Another issued a vague statement about reassessing partnerships. Claire stopped tagging him in her posts altogether. The distance was subtle, but it was there. I didn't feel triumphant. If anything, I felt calm. This wasn't collapse in the dramatic sense. It was erosion, the slow consequence of building on image instead of substance. All I had done was stop shielding them from the truth they'd worked so hard to avoid. And as the ground beneath them shifted, I realized something important. I wasn't pushing anything over. I was just stepping out of the way. The charity auction was the kind of event Evan and Claire loved. Public enough to be photographed, exclusive enough to feel important, and crowded with the sort of people whose opinions quietly shaped careers. When I heard about it through Marcus, I already knew they would be there. Evan never missed an opportunity to be seen, especially when things behind the scenes were starting to wobble. I arrived with Marcus dressed simply, nothing designed to draw attention. I didn't need to stand out. I just needed to be present. The room glittered with polished smiles and expensive fabric conversations drifting between philanthropy and profit in the seamless way people like to pretend those things are connected. Evan and Claire were easy to spot. Claire wore a silver dress that caught the light, with every step her posture immaculate, her smile fixed in place. Evan stayed close, his confidence now more practiced than natural. They spotted me about halfway through the evening. Claire's expression flickered before she recovered her training kicking in. She approached as if this were a coincidence, greeting me warmly, asking how I'd been suggesting that it was nice to see family in a setting like this. Evan nodded along, adding little comments about networking and growth, as if nothing had changed between us. I didn't engage beyond polite replies. There was no point. The room was already doing the work for me. Near the networking table sat a neat stack of informational brochures, provided by sponsors and guests. I added 2 more to the pile when no one was looking. One outlined my logistics platform's pilot results, concise and factual. The other was even simpler, a due diligence brief summarizing publicly available information about Evan's ventures. Same clean design, same neutral tone, no drama, just facts laid out clearly. People picked them up out of curiosity. That was enough. I watched from across the room as conversations stalled mid-sentence, brows furrowed, phones quietly pulled out. Evan noticed too, though he didn't understand at first. He paced near the bar, checking his messages, whispering into his phone. Claire was approached by a woman from the hosting organization, someone with a headset and a clipboard, the kind of person who only interrupts when something has gone wrong. They spoke quietly. Claire nodded her smile, never faltering, but her shoulders stiffened. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere had shifted. Evan looked pale, distracted, his earlier bravado gone. Claire stayed close to him, laughing a little too loudly, steering conversations away from anything specific. I didn't stay to watch the full unraveling. I said my goodbyes to Marcus and left early, stepping out into the cool night air with a sense of finality I hadn't expected. The aftermath came quickly. Within days, Evan's name vanished from another company website. An article began circulating in industry circles questioning the credibility of several high-profile advisors Evan included. Claire took a sudden leave from her job, her social media going quiet after weeks of relentless positivity. The illusion they'd worked so hard to maintain cracked under the weight of simple scrutiny. A week later, my mother sent me a long message. She said she was shocked by what had happened, that she hadn't known things weren't as solid as they'd seemed. She suggested we sit down as a family, talk things through, maybe clear the air. I read it twice, then archived it. I wasn't angry. I was just finished revisiting rooms where I'd never been welcome. The truth was, I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved. The tension that had lived in me for years finally eased, replaced by something steadier. I hadn't exposed anyone out of spite. I'd simply stopped carrying the burden of their image on my back. For the first time, the narrative wasn't theirs to control, and that was enough. By the time everything settled, my life looked nothing like it had a year earlier. Not in the flashy, cinematic way people like to post about online, but in the quiet, structural way that actually lasts. The pilot program expanded into a full regional contract. I registered. The business brought Marcus in as a partner and hired a junior developer who was sharp, curious, and refreshingly unimpressed by titles. We kept things lean. No unnecessary noise, just work that did what it promised. For the first time, my days felt aligned. I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment or waiting for someone else's approval. I was too busy building, adjusting, learning. Mistakes happened, of course, but they were mine, and that made all the difference. When something broke, we fixed it. When something worked, we improved it. There was no performance, no need to look successful before we actually were. A few weeks after the charity auction, my mother reached out again. This time the message was softer, longer, filled with reflection. She said she'd been thinking a lot about the past, about how things might have felt from my perspective. She admitted indirectly that maybe they hadn't always been fair. She asked if we could meet, just the two of us, to talk. I didn't reply right away. I sat with the message for a long time, not because I was angry, but because I finally understood something I hadn't before. Closure doesn't come from conversations like that, not when patterns have been decades in the making. It comes from choosing what you're willing to carry forward and what you're willing to leave behind. I eventually sent a short response. I told her I hoped she was well. I said I was busy, but that maybe someday we could talk. It was honest. It was measured. It didn't promise more than I was prepared to give. Evan and Claire faded from my daily thoughts almost entirely. I heard updates occasionally through distant relatives or mutual acquaintances. Evan tried to rebrand himself, shifting industries, changing the language he used to describe his experience. Claire resurfaced online months later, posting carefully worded content about growth and lessons learned. They carried on as people always do. But the difference was their lives no longer defined mine. One evening, months later, I hosted a small dinner for my team. Nothing elaborate, just a handful of people crowded into my apartment, laughing, trading stories from work, teasing each other about bugs and last-minute fixes. I made pasta salad. The same recipe, the same ingredients. When I set it on the table, someone joked that it must be my signature dish. Everyone laughed. This time the laughter didn't sting. We ate together, passed plates, argued lightly about music, talked about what we wanted to build next. No one was ranked. No one was relegated to the edge of the room. There were enough chairs for everyone, and more importantly, there was respect. That was when it finally hit me. I'd spent years trying to earn a seat at a table that was never designed to hold me. I thought the problem was my effort, my timing, my worth. It wasn't. The problem was that I kept asking permission from people who benefited from keeping me small. I don't hate my family. I don't wish them harm. I just no longer need to stand in rooms where my presence is treated as optional. I built something better instead. Not out of revenge, not out of anger, but out of necessity. I stopped asking for a seat. I built my own table.